Welcome to the Worldwide Robotic Milking Podcast with Gareth Jones of Robotic Milking Systems and John Gerbitz of Cow Corner Consulting. This is the international podcast dedicated exclusively to robotic milking topics from planning through production.
Hi, my name's Gareth Jones from Robotic Milking Systems in the UK.
And I'm John Gerbitz from Cow Corner Robotic Milking Consulting.
And this is our podcast, Worldwide Robotic Milking. So, John, it's been a couple of weeks since we last met. Have you been keeping busy? Seen anything interesting in the last couple of weeks?
I have been busy. I've been on quite a few farms in the last couple of weeks. One that really interesting new experience for me was working with a farm that is milking in stanchions right now in an older barn and going through the decision-making process of how they will adapt robots and whether they should try to retrofit the robots into the existing barn or build new, and looking at all the financial considerations and the cow comfort considerations. But what's really been striking about this is the complete change, all the changes that these cows are going to have to make, from free stalls to TMR to robotic milking. So it's been interesting. Anything exciting that you're working on?
Well, I've picked up my first client in Australia this week, which is quite exciting. Obviously remotely, but looking at designing a compost barn for them, something we don't actually have here in the UK, but seems to be quite popular in New Zealand and Australia. So watch your space on that one.
So you think you're going to have to go to Australia at some point? Have you been to Australia before?
I've been a couple of times, yeah, and this is in Victoria. It's an area I know, but we'll wait and see. It might be a nice opportunity with all when it's all up and running. So, okay, so I think our topic for today is, I think we'd talk about KPIs, or key performance indicators.
So when we talk about KPIs, we've decided to break this into two episodes. So this episode is going to focus primarily on KPIs for robots, and then in our next episode, we'll dig in a little more on the KPIs for cows. And there's going to be a little bit of overlap and a little bit of redundancy in these two conversations, but it really felt like it was too much for one episode. So in terms of yield, what we're seeing in robots in the US, I think it's always important to point out that our national average is about 5,000 pounds per robot. I think that the elite herds are closer to 6, and I did a presentation a couple of years ago on farms that are 7,000 pounds per robot, because that was a marketing claim, and kind of wanted to know how realistic is that marketing claim. And at the time I made the comparison, and maybe a baseball analogy isn't quite right for this international audience, but I compared 7,000 pounds per robot to pitching a no-hitter in baseball, something that certainly can be done and has been done, but it is a real high achievement.
Sorry, you talk about 7,000 pounds is 3,500 kilos roughly, isn't it, a milk per day, which is a huge amount for a robot. The figures I tend to use for my consultancy, and it's really a starting point, not the end point, is to aim for 2,000 kilos per day for a single box. We also have double boxes in our market, the Bomatic double box. So depending on where, what area I'm in, and if there's a Bomatic dealer available, then we can start talking a double box. So as a comparison, it would be about 3,500 kilos per day in a double box. Now, as you said, people are achieving more than this, but it's a good starting point. So I know some Bomatic boxes I've seen doing 4,200 a day. I've seen single boxes doing 3,000 kilos a day. But for me, for my financials, just to have a starting point, that's where I aim at. And then I explain year 2, year 3. Quite often we can do better than that, but then that's going to depend on all the other things we're going to be talking about.
Real important, I think, that you talked about numbers that you're using for budgeting and numbers that people might dream about or realistically hope to achieve. I think that 7,000 pound number, to just go through the math on that, that is 70 cows making 100 pounds a day, and that's probably going to require about 180 milkings to get that done. And all of those are really elite numbers, and there's no wiggle room on any of them. If you're only milking 65 cows, then they've got to produce more per cow. If you're only making 90 pounds, you got to get more cows through that robot. There's just not a lot of wiggle room on that top end, and important to be realistic in the numbers we're budgeting with.
Yeah, absolutely. And lots of dairy farmers can achieve these things for 4 weeks in the year, but the real challenge is to do it every week of the year, every day of the week. That's the challenge. It's the consistency, isn't it? Is where it's at, really. And we'll get on to free time, but also my experience is the harder you push these things, it can put you under a lot of stress, the cows under a lot of stress, and the machine under a lot of stress as well. So I think it's really important that we well, especially for me when I'm budgeting, that I come up with realistic figures that are achievable.
Certainly.
So that's our sort of yield. And then milkings per day isn't something I'm focusing more on yield, and then looking at cow numbers and existing yields to see where we can get to and how many cows we can get on the robot, so I can get a return on that investment. But for you, milkings per day, how would you look at that figure, John? What are you obsessing from that?
So ultimately, I agree that yield is the number that we're looking for, but when yield isn't where we want it to be, looking at the number of milkings per robot. So I think realistically, 150 milkings per robot on the I'm going to say older generation of robots, and on the current generation of robots, we're sometimes reaching in the range of 180 milkings per robot. And I think, again, just how it fits with those other numbers, if we bring that back to, if we're at 6,000 pounds and 150 milkings, what does our yield per milking come out looking like? And if we're at 60 cows per robot and 120 milkings, that's certainly not a good situation to be in, but it's easy math for me to say that's going to come out to 2x. And in order to get to the 2.5 to 3 that we're looking for, it's going to have to be more milkings per robot. And then moving on to other KPIs, what's limiting the number of milkings per robot? Why aren't we where we should be on that? And so it might be a matter of cow flow. It might be a matter of the number of cows in the barn, and then that the farm is still growing and hasn't reached that level yet.
So there's another figure you use is incomplete milkings. Now, again, that's not something I really focus on. So can you tell us a bit more about that, John?
Yeah, so incomplete milking would be the de Laval term, lately closely related, but certainly not the same thing, would be a failed milking. Interestingly enough, they aren't even measuring the same things. The failures is a count of failed milkings in a day, and the incompletes is a percent of cows that were not completely milked out. But what gets interesting when we make those comparisons is that the goals are similar, and that on the current model robots, we're looking at for less than 5% incomplete or less than 5 failures. And for me, this is the primary measure of robot performance. There's certainly other things we look at, but is the robot working the way it's supposed to be doing? And that may go back to maintenance or adjustments, things like that. But it's the most objective way to determine whether the robot is doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Okay, so so for you, 5% is the territory you want to be below. 5%, is that sort of territory? Yes. You're looking for?
Yes.
Okay, And historically, maybe figures have been, what, twice that?
I've seen, yes, much higher than that. I've seen 10s and 15s. And what's interesting is that how that ties together with milking duration or box time, as we commonly call it. And since those milking duration numbers include prep time and the incompletes, it's going to take longer to attach those cows when the robot is struggling, and so we see box times get much longer, and it ties back to the number of milkings and the capacity we can have, and how it's always been interesting to me with robotic milking how it really all comes back to math, and one way or another there's an equation that can tell us what we need to tweak in order to get more out of the box. And as these incomplete or failed milkings increase, we see milking durations get longer, and it really will limit the capacity of the robot.
And would you say that the reason for incompletes falling or having got to that level, is that mostly down to technology, or are you seeing other reasons that are really affecting that, John?
I think when I'm looking at this, certainly to begin with, there are cow factors as well. So a udder with poor conformation, or a cow that doesn't stand still in the robot, we certainly need to recognize that there are cow factors that can contribute to those numbers. And if there is a cow that doesn't attach well, that prefers a certain robot, or two or three of those, all of a sudden it can skew the numbers. But I really think we need to focus first when we have a high number of failed milkings or a high number of incompletes, to focus on the robot. And so, the basic things, is the camera clean? Is the cow standing positioned correctly in the stall? Are the maintenance kits being done in a timely manner? I was at a farm last week just observing the robots, and I really don't get into I don't bring tools to work. I use tools at home, but I don't use tools at work. But just watching the arm move and seeing it shake, and then when it was at rest, grabbing the arm and finding the point where it was sloppy. Sometimes it's relatively easy to pick these things out. Other times it can be much more complicated, and it's something that's a little deeper in the software and what the machine thinks it knows about the cows. So troubleshooting those sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's much more difficult, but it's really important. It's going to pay off not only in terms of better milking for the cow, and so far I've talked about this in terms of box time, but really before that we need to talk about cows that are not getting milked out correctly, and what that can do to milk yield, and also milk quality and somatic cell count and mastitis prevalence in the herd.
Yeah, so all sorts of implications, and like you said, I suppose it's doing the daily routine work, like cleaning the laser, or it's so important, isn't it, just to keep things running, or laser or camera, I should say, depending on which brand you're using. Yeah, that's one of the fundamentals, I guess, and that's the first go-to, I suppose, if your incomplete suddenly rise, is everything clean and working as it should be? So
yeah, the low-hanging fruit is to look for cleanliness and look for slop in the linkages in the robot, and after that it gets more complicated, and oftentimes the dealer or the manufacturer needs to be involved in troubleshooting those, but they don't get better if they ignore it. It really is a problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. And the next one, which is a bit of a favorite of mine, because I just think it's mathematics is quite interesting, and this is idle time or free time. What is idle time, free time, John? Where does it fit in?
So idle time or free time is time when the robot isn't doing anything else. One of the things that people get confused on with this is wash time idle time or not. Wash time, the robot is doing something when it's washing, so that is not idle time. But one of the things that we maybe don't think about as much is that cow that hangs out in the robot after she's done milking. So once the milking activity is done, the clock stops. But if she's standing in the bowl or standing in the stall to lick out any feed that's left in the bowl, now the idle time clock is ticking. And so sometimes we think about getting more cows to the robot, so there's always a cow waiting in line, and that is an important component of it. But there's also this idea that the cow that's waiting in the robot is contributing to free time and slowing things down. So you've got some thoughts on this, and I'm sure it plays into the projects that you're working on and the expectations you create for farmers.
Yeah, it is an interesting one, because I've done a survey around all different brands in throughout the UK, really just to show or dispel the myth maybe that one machine is quicker than another. So I've ranked it in terms of best performing machine, and I won't say which one it was, and it's not important, because what it tells you is that the highest yielding cows with the best milk speed and the least amount of free time are actually going to produce the most amount of milk, per robot per day. I mean, it's as simple as that. But also, free time, I'm normally looking for 10% minimum, because what I find is I've been to farms that are on 3%, so output looks great, but when they get a problem, when they got to service those machines, and if it's a free access system, they end up fetching more cows. There seems to be a direct link between free time and cow fetching. So it's an interesting one. 10% seems to be the sweet spot for me in terms of getting the best return on the machine without stressing yourself out and the cows too much. I've seen as high as 20%, which is a luxury for a lot of people because of the economics behind it. But also that I've seen 20% where there's no fetching going on with free access. So that's an interesting one. So I'll normally aim for 10 in terms of my advice. And I do really warn against going a lot below that, because it's stressful territory in my experience. So yeah, those are the sort of figures I'll work off, John.
That's interesting. I agree with the 10%, and I get nervous with the 8s and 9s. You mentioned a 3, and I have not seen a 3.
Okay,
that's clipping right along. You think about the time it takes for one cow to leave and another cow to come in. You got to be pretty close to 3. There's got to just about always be a cow waiting. But anyway, back to the goals that we talked about, and I would say for me that 10 to 15 range is quite comfortable. I do find that in heifer pens, if I can get up in the 15 to 20 range, it allows a little more time for those timid heifers to learn the robot. And so sometimes I've got one barn that has a fresh cow pen, and we've tried to stock that one so that it's more at 20% free time, and then we can make up that time in the other pens and push it a little lower. The other thing that's been interesting on this is some of these barns that have added extra robots and overstocked the stalls end up having extra robot capacity. And I think they're really justifying that extra robot capacity in terms of the extra cows that they're milking, the milk per stall. But I do also see on those robots that tend to be in the 20 to 25% idle time, we see a little bit higher persistency in lactation curves on those barns. I don't think it pencils out to say my cows are going to be more persistent if I add an extra robot. I don't think that extra milk is going to pay for the extra robot. But in cases where we've seen more cows in the barn because of the extra robots, the extra persistency has kind of come along with it.
Yeah, when you talk about persistency, that's length of lactation.
Maintaining higher production later in lactation.
Okay, not
So
a term I'm
we're,
familiar with. Okay, interesting.
yeah, where our normal lactation curve might look like for mature cows around 80 days, they're reaching the peak, and then by 100, 120 days, they're tailing off, and we'll see them tail off more slowly, maintain higher production longer, where they can continue milking more frequently. So, as milking permission or milk access begins to limit milkings for these late lactation cows, which is right, and which is what we have to do in order to have the maximum capacity for the box. But where we don't have that limitation with the extra robot capacity, we are seeing cows more persistent in that way.
Interesting. Is there anything else you want to bring up today in terms of robot key performance indicators, John? And do you think our next pod now will be looking at the cow performance?
Yes, I think we've covered that pretty well. I really don't have anything to add. I think the important thing is to have these realistic expectations, and also to be aware that they all go together, and if one is out of line, it's going to throw another one out of line as well.
Yeah. Catch you next time. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Worldwide Robotic Milking Podcast, where Gareth Jones of Robotic Milking Systems and John Gerbitz of Cow Corner Consulting share their insights on robotic milking around the world. Join us again for the next episode, and be sure to like the show where you listen to podcasts.